In 1970, I rented a farmhouse outside the Amish community of Kelowna, Iowa. And every few days I would go to visit my neighbor, Joe Miller, to get milk from him. Joe was a real character, and he walked with a pronounced limp. He stuttered, and he told interminable stories. About 14 years after this poem is set, I sat down and wrote this poem because Joe was still firmly in my mind. And I took a drive down to see him. And I said, Joe, I've written a poem about you. And I'd like to read it to you, because if you find it offensive or, in any way you're displeased with it, I'll tear it up on the spot. So I read the poem, and he kind of nodded his head, and he said, "Yep, Kenny, that's me all right." Joe Miller. I would walk the half mile down the gravel road, past the pond and the draft horses, past Irv Chupp's son, chasing his sister's braids, to Joe Miller's place. He'd be in the barn. He'd hobble out to greet me like a large, raw-boned elf. He'd take my gallon jar and swoop back into the dark of the barn. He'd settle on a low stool, his gimp leg splayed out to one side, and start in milking. He'd squirt the milk directly into my jar, and every 10 beats, he'd shoot a stream at one of the gray barn cats fawning at his flanks. I might say, "Joe, why do those guinea hens make that funny noise?" He'd say, "Kenny, I heard something. Now, it may not be true." Well, to make a long story short, and he'd launch into a wild meander on guineas and their secret idiosyncrasies. By then, we'd have moved out next to his buggy under the willow tree. The rasp of the cicadas blended with the astral whir of the guineas. The sun had slid down on the horizon. I had a beard then, wore denim clothes and a beat-up straw, so Joe and the others regarded me, I guess, as an offbeat partisan. He might snatch up a copy of the Amish paper with news from the colony in Venezuela that Toby Miller, son of Daniel, had fallen from his horse, had broken a leg, but was on the mend. Joe's job was leading horses into the ring at the local sale barn. I was there once when the auctioneer deferred to him. "Joe, what do you know about this horse?" Joe lurched to a stop, paused a second, then said, "Well, he's got wind like Freddie Schwarzenegger and goes down the road like Chrissy Ropp." The locals got their chuckle out of that, but he'd given them the goods. Joe's wife, Fanny, would appear at the back door in gray dress, wire rims, her thick ankles. With hands on hips, she'd yell out, "Joe Miller!" He'd tap me briskly on the shoulder and say, "Well, Kenny, gotta go now. See you in a few days." And swing that leg toward the house with all those cats in tow.